everybody for coming out in the glorious Minnesota weather. So, for those of you that don't know me, I'm Dave Nichols. I'm the executive director here. And today we are going to have a quick talk about Chief Taopi.
Not too quick.
Not too quick, but quick enough. So I'm going to start by prefacing this with saying that of all the different characters that we get to research around here, Taopi is one of the ones that is the hardest to research. Like a lot of Dakota, there is a lot of resources on him that are not directly his. He's one of those people that you get information about him from the people around him and not so much from him himself. And as you'll see as we'll go through some of this, there are different questions about certain periods in his life because depending on what source you ask, they will give you a different answer. So it seems like the best place to start is at the beginning. So he was born in 1813. He was born to Capiosia village, which is the same village that Chief Little Crow was a part of. It is a Metawakiton village, so for those of you that are from around here, we had Wapakuta was the main Dakota band that was here in Rice County. Metawakiton were a bit further north of here and along the east. So he earned his name, the Wounded Man, after going to battle with the Ojibwe. He was heavily wounded in that battle, was down for between 3 to 5 days, again, pick your source, was believed that he would not survive and yet ended up pulling through. And so earned his epitaph of Taopi, which is loosely translates to the Wounded Man. What his name was prior to taking on this name, we don't know. So that's one of the interesting things about Dakota naming is when they earn a name, they drop their old one. And so it can be difficult sometimes to still have a record of what those previous names were. So from as early as his 20s, he started going by the name of Taopi. And like I said, prior to that, we have no real record of what the name he used was. So he was born to two people, as all of us are. His mother was Old Bets because I struggle so much at saying her name. Some of you may recognize her. We've had several books on her. She was a very prominent person. She actually came with Taopi and several of the other Dakota that came to live here in Faribault. I love this picture for several different reasons. Old Bets would go on to become one of the most famous female Native Americans in the world because of this picture. This was one of those pictures that would sort of get circulated around the world, was one of the first major photographs used in the Smithsonian to document Sioux women at the time. One of the things that I love when I talk about this picture, especially with other people, is how blatantly wrong it is. For example, it says that in 1862 she was 120 years old. No. So yeah, she died in, that's supposed to say 1873. She was not, didn't live that long. So clearly nowhere near 120 years old.
Yeah.
So his mother ran a canoe service along the Minnesota, or along the Mississippi River in St. Paul. That was sort of what she did with her time. His father, depending on who you ask, was either Iron Sword or Flying Sword. And as you can see by the names, they are drastically different. So there are debates as to whether it's an interpretation error. There aren't really any records that we can find of an Iron Sword in that band, but there are records of a Flying Sword. However, Flying Sword was drastically younger than Old Bets, which means nothing, by the way. But from what we can find, she would have been probably in her 30s, and Flying Sword would have been about 18 at the time. So quite the age discrepancy there. One of the things you might notice is it says that Taopi was born in 1813, and she was born in 1803. The birth date is also wrong, because that is the birth date that's on her headstone, but we can't find any record of where that date comes from. This is one of the things that happens with a lot of Dakota and Native American individuals is birth dates and even time in general is recorded so differently than how we record time, that being able to pin down how old somebody is sort of a, you gotta massage the numbers a little bit and do a lot of working backwards. From what we can tell from when she died, she was probably about 82. So she would have been closer to about 20, in her 20s when she would have had Taopi. Another person that bears mentioning, we'll see it a little bit later, but if you look at Taopi's headstone, which is in Maple Lawn Cemetery here, it has himself listed, and then Cornelia Whipple Taopi, which is his daughter. She was only 18 years old when she died. One of the other things that's really interesting is we can't find anywhere a record of who her mother was. We know that she was his daughter, as referenced by the name. But we have no listing of a mother, and no idea where to even start to look for those records.
So those birth dates were also wrong, 45 to 79. You said she was 19?
18, yeah.
18, yeah.
Yeah. So this is one of the things that I ran into, especially a lot when researching him, is just how off they are.
Where's Old Betts buried?
Old Betts is, ooh, that's a good question. I don't know that one off the top of my head.
Because you said on the headstone.
On the headstone for Taopi, I'm sorry.
Okay.
No. So one of the things that it's important for us to establish pretty early on is the idea of blanket Indians and farmer Indians. Taopi is considered in Minnesota to be sort of the leader of the farmer Indians. He becomes one of sort of the main proponents of that way of life and ends up being held up as sort of the premier example of farmer Indian. So what that means is farmer Indians are individuals that sort of have given up their Dakota culture or Ojibwe culture, whatever culture, and adopted white settler traditions and ways of living. What I find very fascinating about this photo is you can see a bit of both, because blanket Indians are those that didn't do that tried to keep their traditional culture, their traditional ways of life. And this picture is fantastic because it shows you both ways of life at the same time. It's a great transition photo showing how you have families living together where half of them are on this side and half are on that side. And Dan, it kind of goes to what you and I were talking about earlier in that sort of argument.
Where was that photo taken, do you know?
So this was taken on the Dakota reservation that was along the Minnesota River. This is dated, I want to say, 1858. So this is not Taopi, but this is a great example to sort of reference these two ideas. So as I mentioned, Taopi is sort of held up as the leader of farmer Indians. And where that title comes from actually is US censuses. So if you're going through a census, you'll see one of the things you can put in there is occupation. And there will be farmer-Indian as opposed to just farmer. And so that's where that title comes from, and then sort of inversely created the blanket Indian title. So we all know who that guy is, and if you don't, that's Bishop Whipple. So Taopi is one of the very first, Taopi is one of the very first individuals that Bishop Whipple began working with when he came to Minnesota in 1860. One of the first places that he visited was the Lower Sioux Indian Reservation, and that's where Wabasha and Good Thunder and Taopi had been moved as Dakota. one of the very first things that they did in sort of collaboration was establishing the Hazelwood Republic. It is not a nation, it is a school. It's effectively a Dakota-run Indian boarding school. It's one of the very few that we see like that. It's very much in the same line as the boarding school that was here in Faribault, where it didn't have as much of the, how do I say, destructive nature that later boarding schools would, but it absolutely promoted assimilationism. It promoted Christianity as the primary faith and tried to really push the Dakota that would go to this school, and bearing in mind that this school was not just for children, but also for adults. So it would be for all ages, really trying to push them to assimilate and take on white culture. This school was actually a dream of, man, my spelling is terrible, Wabasha and Good Thunder and Taopi, and then once meeting Bishop Whipple and his sort of experience at building up missions, building up schools, helped them get the funding to establish that school. From pretty much this point on, Good Thunder and Taopi would be the two primary Dakota that Bishop Whipple would correspond with and work with throughout the rest of all of their lives, for the most part. Bishop Whipple was very close with Taopi. He did not confirm him into the Episcopal faith. He had actually already been confirmed several years earlier. But having met Bishop Whipple, basically, okay, this is my guy, and continued to work with him. With several other tribes, would act as a translator for Bishop Whipple in certain cases, and would also act somewhat as an emissary, going to different reservations, different tribes, things like that, trying to, again, promote that farmer assimilationist view.
So Taopi had been to school because he could read?
So we don't know. That's one of the interesting things, is we assume that he knew how to read, but again, we don't have letters from him like we do from some others. He doesn't have an autobiography. We know that Bishop Whipple would write letters to him, but we don't have ones back. So it's a little difficult to tell how much he knew. What he may have been able to read, but maybe not so much write. Hard for us to tell.
So where was that school at? Hazelwood and,
So the Hazelwood Republic was on the Dakota reservation,
oh, Lower Sioux.
the Lower Sioux Reservation. Yep.
And where's the Lower Sioux Reservation
So
at?
Lower Sioux Reservation is over near Morton, Minnesota.
By Redwood Falls.
Yeah,
Right,
there you go.
okay.
Redwood Falls is a much better place. So
Okay.
over in that.
Jackpot joke.
Yeah, there you go.
Oh, okay. Yeah, now we all
That's
know.
that. So, one of the ways that sort of Taopi sort of came to statewide and national interest was during the conflict in 1862. So, on top of being the leader of sort of farmer Indians, he also was the leader of the Peace Party of the Dakota in the 1862 conflict. So when the Dakota decided to basically start their assault on settlers in western Minnesota, there were two branches that are often sort of viewed in that conversation. There's the War Party and the Peace Party, and they do exactly what they say on the tin. What's really interesting about this to me is that Chief Little Crow is seen as the leader of the War Party, and Taopi is seen as the leader of the Peace Party. They are, in effect, cousins. They grew up in the same village. They were born in and around the same time. And so, to me, it's an interesting piece of the story to really show this sort of huge divide that ends up happening between these people, that half of them see this as their only way to survive and the other as this is their only way to survive. And it's not just different bands, it's people within the same band, within the same family being split this way. So one of the very first things that happens, so the Yellow Medicine Reservation or agency is destroyed. That's one of the first acts in this event. And Taopi and Good Thunder actually go and get several different settlers that are also on this reservation, different traders, and are sort of shuffling them to different places to try to get them away from the Dakota. Some are sent to hide in the fields and sort of get below the reeds and the crops. Others are shuffled into the local church, and they basically bar the door and are there for about 2 days before the fighting has moved on enough that they can move out. So after that point, he is sort of working behind the front lines to save as many villagers as he can, trying to forward them to places like Mankato and St. Peter, which would end up being major refugee areas during the conflict. He would do his best to try and get in touch with Bishop Whipple and several other contacts that he had to try and, one, let them know what's happening sort of on the back end of things, and also informing him about the efforts that he's doing. A lot of this is, he's telling this guy is running, and then getting that message out. Like I said, not so much in the way of written records. Yes?
Remind us again who Good Thunder was that his father?
No, so Good Thunder was another Metawakanton Dakota chief that had been moved to the reservation and they had become friends. Whole other thing. So once the bulk of the conflict had been pretty much quelled, the Dakota had been captured, or they had been sort of rounded up or forced west, as a lot of, there were several Dakota that straight fled the state as things were starting to calm down. Taopi and Good Thunder, along with so many others, were rounded up and taken to Pike Island. So before sort of the November, December time period, the ideas of a war party and a peace party did not exist. To the Army and everyone else, there were Dakota and they were all guilty, regardless of what they had been doing. So they would eventually all be sent up to Fort Snelling after the hanging in Mankato, but prior to that they were held on Pike Island.
Where's Pike Island?
So Pike Island is, Pike Island is,
Right next to Walleye Lake.
yeah.
Where the Minnesota River and the Mississippi River
Yeah.
come together.
Yeah, what's interesting about that island is it's actually a Dakota sacred site. So the fact that it ends up getting turned into a prison is really demeaning. We actually have worked with the ancestor of the woman who owned that island, and it was basically co-opted in a treaty and then a couple of years later turned into a temporary internment. So that's where the Dakota were held from September until about mid-November. There were about 1,600 Dakota that had been rounded up and moved to that island. And it's not a very big island. It's about a mile in diameter. It's not very large.
Is it on the map there?
It's not on the map here. It would be in and around here. So this is where the Mississippi and Minnesota River combine. It's near Fort Snelling over here. So,
Was he part of the 380 that were supposed to be hanged?
no.
So
Because, so, that's the thing, is in October and November, that's when the Army started doing the generously called trials of going through what actually happened, starting to sort things out. And that's when they sort of this delineation between those that were peaceful, trying to help people, and those that were actually engaging in conflict is sussed out. So there were enough testimonies from survivors that were able to say that no, really, he was helping us. that there was really no chance of him getting on that list.
But he wasn't a young man then, he was like almost 50.
He was, yeah. So, in mid-November, all 1,600 Dakota are marched from, again, Pike Island, which is around here, all the way down to Mankato. They're marched military style, and bear in mind that these 1,600 are not sort of Dakota warriors. These are the women, the children, the elderly, and those that were trying to be helpful
In the winter?
in the winter. There are accounts of basically the roads between Fort Snelling, for the most part, and Mankato just being lined with settlers, and the soldiers were there not to protect the people, but to protect the Dakota, because they would be pelted with rocks, there would be things thrown at them, people would try to kill them on the way there.
So they were going from St. Paul to
They-
Mankato?
Yeah,
I just thought it was the other way around.
nope, they do, they eventually go back.
Okay.
So they're marched to Mankato to watch the hanging.
Oh, no.
And then, after that, that's when they're actually taken directly to Fort Snelling and the main internment camp that ends up getting built there.
Yeah. And I had heard the guys from New Ulm were probably some of the worst. They were, even the women were coming out trying to,
Yeah.
few babies got killed. And
Yeah.
I was in Henderson.
they were nice people.
No. A couple of years ago, right before the ride that happens in Mankato, had taken a break now, I guess, because it's going to be starting up again. I was standing next to a gentleman, and him and I were talking, and he said his wife has a family story that her great-great-grandfather wrote in his diary that he had walked all the way from St. Paul just to watch them hang. And that, to me, is, I can't imagine that level of hate today, but that was everywhere in this state. Yeah, it's mind-boggling, I think, for any of us to imagine that level of just hate for somebody.
But that lives on.
It sure does. I've given this presentation other places, and I've had many other ancestors go, and I still hate them. It's like, you never met these people, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Could you point New Ulm out to us where?
Yeah, absolutely. So New Ulm is right here.
Okay.
Mankato's here. They're about 40 miles apart.
Okay.
St. Peter, and then Fort Snelling's up here.
As someone who grew up in that area, I can attest to the fact that there's animosity that exists
Yes.
until
Wow.
this day.
Very much
Yeah.
so.
And I had relatives that lived around New Ulm, and they actually fled to St. Peter, and then
Yep.
they put in a claim for damage to their crops.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, I tried to get a Dakota on the board of Part of America. Good luck.
Yeah. So again, about the very beginning of January, they arrive here. The hanging of Mankato, again, happened the day after Christmas. Was originally scheduled for Christmas, and then they looked at a calendar, realized what it was, and went, you can't do a hanging on Christmas, and so moved it by a day. After the hanging, they were marched back to Fort Snelling into the more permanent internment camp. Taopi would again kind of become a leader in that camp, helping to sort of make sure everyone was taken care of. Bishop Whipple was visiting on at least a weekly basis, bringing supplies, because there were very few supplies afforded the Dakota at Fort Snelling, especially in the dead of winter. There are reports that the soldiers would simply not give them the supplies, or to make up for shortfalls in their own supplies, they would take it from them. And so Bishop Whipple and several others across the state were sort of doing these supply drives and running them up every week.
Did you ever encounter any information about Taopi that he was not baptized by Bishop Whipple?
Yep, he wasn't, from what I can see.
He was?
He wasn't.
He was?
He was already christened before Bishop Whipple had arrived. From the records I found, he was christened in about 1855-ish, 1856. So in 1863, there's an agreement reached between Governor Ramsey, Bishop Whipple, and Alexander Fairboe to bring a small group of the Dakota that remained here. Most of them were members of the Peace Party. So about 180 of those 1,600 Dakota were allowed to remain and come here to Fairboe. The rest were sent out of state.
Is that Taopi there?
No, that's Alexander Fairboe.
Okay.
Of the 180 that came here, 80 of them were direct relatives of Taopi. So most of them were his family that ended up coming here, including his mother and his daughter and several other more extended family. Here in
Is
Fairboe,
that because of his connection to Wicca?
probably. A lot of the records that Bishop Whipple writes about is that he wanted to save those that had no hand in the fighting. Most of the other families that end up coming, that sort of other 100, are family members of the Dakota Scouts that ended up linking up with the Army soldiers and helping to chase after the Dakota that would flee further west or had already been a part of sort of scout detachments prior to that. Man, that's a lot of rain. So
What did Taopi, I mean, he was like 50 then. What did he do, like, in his working years, 22 to 50?
So prior to the treaty that took him to the reservation, he was a farmer, like many of them were. That was, if you were an assimilated Dakota, farming was your job. That's what you were basically trained to do. Which makes sense. Early Minnesota farming was 90% of the work that was done here, right? So, and then even up until the 1862 conflict, again, he had a very large farm. He was helping to run the Hazelwood Republic. Those were sort of his two main jobs. Once they came here to Fairboe, he became a major leader among those Dakota and just in the city in general. He helped with ensuring that the Dakota that were here were protected because, you know, we often tell the story that Fairboe saved these Dakota, but not everybody here in town was happy to have them. And there were people that knew they were here and did not like they were here. So there are several newspaper reports of people coming to town to deal with the Dakota that were left and all kinds of stories like that. So Taopi did a lot to coordinate the Dakota that were here. So the land around the Alexander Fairboe house, so if you know where Peace Park is at, sort of down all that area there, that was where they were at. There were walls erected around the Fairboe house. At that point, Alexander had moved out of the Fairboe house, and so that area sort of became where the Dakota were at. And the walls were put up again, not more for defense of the Dakota than for anything else. It was a way for them to have a level of protection. So, Taopi did not live terribly long here in Faribault for as pivotal as a impact he made on the city. By the time that he had passed, many of the Dakota that had remained here had already moved on. Many of them had, after a few years here in town, dealing with the violence towards them that I had mentioned earlier, and just plain missing their families, had decided to end up voluntarily moving to several of the different reservations across the country. By the time he died in 1869, of that 180, about 90 had already moved on in just those few years. So he died in 1869 after falling ill. We still have no idea what exactly he fell ill with. None of the records are overly descriptive. We just know that he had gone out hunting one day, and when he came back, he was ill and just continued to get sicker and sicker and sicker. And so Bishop Whipple actually, at his own request, read Taopi his last rites and presided over his funeral, and, you know, led them out to Maple Lawn where he would be buried. This is the gravestone I was mentioning earlier. It's very distinct, you cannot miss it if you are out there, because it's got this sort of tripod here. And this is actually stone, not wood, this frame here. So it's very interesting to me that they put that sort of Dakota,
Yeah.
almost teepee-like shape there at that particular gravestone. So again, he's buried here in town, and he's one of the very few Dakota to have a burial here in town.
Huh.
Yes?
When you say read his last rites, what does that mean?
So last rites are in Catholic belief, and then Episcopal and several other religions, sort of final prayers over somebody that's passing or has passed to sort of prepare them for that transition into the next life.
Okay.
And so that's what that was all about.
What did he have for family then?
Nobody, for the most part. His daughter would die a few years after him. His mother had already passed. So really, there weren't very many family. Even the family that had come with him, those were a lot of the 90 that had left to go with other branches of their family. So yeah, by the time that he passed, it was pretty much his daughter was the only direct relative that was still here in town.
So you said he was one of the few Dakota buried in Fairville, who are the other ones? Where are they?
Well, Pelagie, who is Alexander's mother,
Oh, Ash.
she's also buried up at, all of the pharaohs are up at, Calvary.
Where's the daughter buried at?
With him.
With him, okay.
So,
So, I understand that the Peace Park has some native graves there, but they're not marked.
yes, sort of. We know that there were at least two, because in various different attempts to develop that area of the park, there were remains found. There's a news article from, I want to say it's 1878, maybe 1873, something that looks similar to that anyway, where they were digging and they came across it was a hide with bones in it, and that was a traditional way to bury a Dakota. Yes?
Where is Peace Park?
So Peace Park is over by Buckham Library. It's on the opposite side of town.
Yep.
And there's a little triangular piece of land right there by the viaduct. That is
That's
Peace
it,
Park.
that's it. Okay.
Yep,
And the state archaeologist has it listed
Yeah,
as a cemetery.
they do.
Oh,
So they haven't done many more digs since then, but there have been 2 instances where they've dug and found bones. We have records that there were burials done near the Fairville house. So at this point, that area has just been designated a burial site. That park also has a little bit of interesting history that, I'm gonna go off topic because I can. That it was donated by Alexander Fairville to the city with the explicit instructions that it never be developed.
wow.
So the fact that they've tried several times, the former director, Sue and I had to actually pull that out on the city once
Wow.
or twice. So, yeah, so that area is a protected burial site. We don't know if there are any left there, but we know that there were some found there, so it's still treated as one.
But it's not marked.
It's not marked, because again, we don't know how many would be there, and there are ways to test, but without risking disturbing them. It's easier to just cordon off the area and leave it as it is. That's sort of what's been asked at this point, yes.
So if there were 2 there, where did those 2 go?
So they ended up being reburied, from what I can see in the record. So the 1878 article says that basically where they dug, they just filled that back in.
So the bones are still there?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but whether there are any more, we don't know. So,
But the marker there is some military.
yeah, the marker there is actually for honoring veterans from World War II.
Yeah.
So completely unrelated. Yes.
When they were reburied, but is there any like signage of where they were buried, or is it completely?
Not that I know of, and that's pretty restricted information, so if it is, I'm sure the state archaeologist has it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't.
Okay.
So,
I'm just curious.
No, that's a fair question, yeah.
Well, it seems to me if it was especially designated by Alexander Fairbolt and his wife, and I know that's true, because I've seen the original plat book,
Yep.
then isn't that why don't we especially designate it?
So it is
I mean,
designated,
there's no designation.
so it's
Like a
designated
marker.
as a burial ground by the state archaeologist. So now the city can't do anything. There have been attempts to put a marker there in the past just to acknowledge it. I know we've worked with the state historical society and the state archaeologist to get one of the, the big historic marker type signs. And it's been backburnered time and time again, ends up being the issue.
And I think Jeff Jarvis
Mm-hmm.
knows some of the
Yep.
relatives of the people who lived here.
Yeah, Jeff has done a lot of work
And
on it
so
too.
they're trying to be, they're trying to work with the descendants
Yep.
to make sure that
Yeah, that's been part of it too, is we know at least, we are at least able to tie back to the bands that would have been here, that would have led to those burials based on the records we have. So trying to work with them, but again, most of them are outside of the state. And it kind of becomes its own, so many different threads and tendrils that you gotta pull on to make it all happen. Again, I would argue that even a simple, stone dealio that just says would be great.
Yeah.
But I don't have the authority to go put a stone out there, unfortunately. Yeah.
Do you ever run across any evidence, we would like to think that we taught the Dakota how to farm, but I was listening to Sheldon Wolfchild, he lives out by the lower Sioux, and there, and he was saying that when the settlers got here, they had 5,000 acres of corn they're growing, or that was estimated. And they also found another site, I think it's outside of Mankato, but it's pretty hard to find out which farm it's on, because they don't want people going up there.
Yes.
It's like 9,000 years ago, they found, I suppose you'd say village or dwelling where it had a cache where you could put a ton of corn.
Yeah,
And so they were growing and stocking corn.
they were. Early Dakota agriculture is not as we would think of agriculture today. More what it is taking advantage of naturally occurring areas. So take wild rice, for example, right? It grows along banks of certain bodies of water. Instead of transplanting it to other areas and then creating new crops, they would cultivate the existing areas. So the same thing with local corn, they would find it, and then that would be a place that villages might be set up, or be a constant place that they would be coming back to, where again, they'd be stocking it, but it wouldn't be, they wouldn't necessarily try to grow the field the way that we might, take on more acres or anything like that. And sort of, when I say they taught them to farm, they sort of taught them to farm in the white European way of farming. That's sort of how they had been doing it before. And yeah, there's evidence of Dakota engaging in at least that form of agriculture as far back as 9,000 to 10,000 years from what we can find in the area, even around here. So, a couple of things that most people don't know is that a little bit south of here in Malheur County, there's a city called Taopi. It is
I
named,
live near there.
there you go.
You're an expert.
It is named after him. What I can't find out is the why.
That's
They
good. I
decided to
agree.
name it after him. It was founded by a milling company, basically. Some farmers had gone out there and set up the town. They were, from records I can find, from around here, and that is the closest we can find as any tie as to why they would name it after him. Is they were from here, they knew the name, they wanted to honor him, and so named the town after him. There had been talk in about the 1870s of renaming one of the lakes around here after him. I don't know which one it would have been, because we can't find records. There was this talk of we're gonna name a lake after Taopi, and then it never happened. So maybe naming the city was their way of carrying that on. But that's one of the things that not many people know, so I like to talk about that. As I mentioned earlier, I think Taopi's story is a great example of the divisions that ended up being created within the Dakota, in the sense of, throughout the 1862 conflict, even prior to that, with the sort of tensions within the Dakota themselves, he is having to fight with his family this entire time, having to, once the conflict breaks out, great, you're actively going against your own cousin to try and end this conflict. And that is a story that repeats over and over and over throughout the different threads that we pull on that. And I think he's a great sort of case study to talk about those things that happen. One of the other things that's very interesting about him is when we look back and we talk about farmer Indians and blanket Indians and sort of the ideas of assimilation, he has sort of become the poster child for what an assimilated Dakota looks like. And I don't think that's unearned. He very much was himself a staunch assimilationist. I think when we talk about assimilationism and we think about it today, we think about this idea that kind of comes out of the boarding schools of destroying Dakota culture to supplant it with white American culture. Taopi very much took the stance that Bishop Whipple did when it came to assimilation, that it's not that the Dakota way of life was in any way wrong. It was that the way the world was, you either assimilated or you would be destroyed. That was the view they held. And sadly, that's not far off what happened. As you start looking at the conflicts that started happening further out west, it was refusal to give up traditions and ways of life that led to the conflicts, that led to a lot of the death and destruction that ended up happening. That is not to say that assimilation was the right road, bear in mind. But he is sort of the one that we talk about when we're looking at that assimilationism and sort of what, from a Dakota aspect, it looks like. And we don't have very many individuals that we have as much detail on to be able to talk about it from a Dakota standpoint.
Do we know where he actually lived in Faribault and what he lived in, or?
So he lived near the Faribault house. Possibly in it at one point or another, because there were several teepees and lodges that would be set up in and around that area. But up until he passed, he was still living on that land near around the Faribault house. Now, despite the fact that I've already answered several questions, I am happy to answer any more. I'm also going to plug our program for next month, which is on the Métis. They are an indigenous group out of Canada, and I know you're probably thinking, how do we relate to Canada, except for French Canadians? But the Métis are indigenous group that is sort of, was created, not that was already here. It came about of relations between the original indigenous people in Canada and European fur traders that were coming over, and they sort of created this whole other indigenous group in and of themselves, just within that. And what that's fascinating is that is the same story that led to Alexander Faribault. He is also half Dakota, half European settler. So she's going to talk a lot about that and how that ties back to the fur trade and things around here in Faribault. So I encourage you to come to that program next month. Questions?
When Taopi died in 1869,
69.
can you give us, if you know, an idea of how big Faribault was at the time as a town? I mean, did it?
Yeah, I want to say
Have it
Faribault was about 2,000 people at that time.
And how far would the boundaries have taken us? Past division or central?
It would have taken you past that, because even where Shattuck and St. Mary's is today was within the city limits at that point.
Up on the hill?
Yeah.
But on the
Yeah.
west side, I wonder how far it went.
Well, the original town went to at least F.
Where?
Yeah, I would say you're,
Avenue.
yeah,
Fourth?
Fifth,
Fifth Avenue?
yeah, because we live in the original town.
yeah, if I'm remembering my plat maps right, and don't hold me to this, please, I wanna say probably right around where Lindale is sort of would
Wow.
have been the
Yeah.
edge of that at that time for the city limits. So,
Because at that time, there was the school for the deaf and the school for the blind,
Mhm.
they were 1863, I
Yep.
think.
Yep.
Really?
And the original school for the deaf was really on the back part of where Alexander Fairwell House is now. It was an old building that they started classes in.
Huh.
yep, and then they ended up moving it up to the hill after Alexander donated some land.
So I have a question.
Yep.
See, you said Taopi was a community leader, so what do
Yes.
you mean by that?
So what I mean by that as a community leader is he ended up becoming in many ways the spokesman for the Faribault Dakota. Whenever there would be some sort of conflict, he would be the one sent out as the representative of this group. He would often work with Alexander and Bishop Whipple when working with the city and the townspeople. He would sort of be the,
Like a mediator, kind
yeah, that's probably the best way to word it. And so I often refer to him then as a community leader among that, as he's sort of the bridge between the two.
of? Okay.
Do
Yes.
you have any idea what was the population of the Dakota prior to 1862? Prior to the treaties around
Yeah.
there?
That's a hard number to pin down.
Yeah.
I don't have a good number
Really
for that.
wasn't-
I could spitball somewhere in the realm of about 3,000 is what was living on that reservation. So the reservation along the Minnesota River, and I don't have that map in this, it was a 50-mile long by 3-mile wide strip along the Mississippi, or the Minnesota River, going from pretty much the South Dakota border down along the river. So,
But it's really hard for us to peer beyond, that's what I found out, is that we start history in 1862.
Yeah,
Prior to that, we don't know anything.
right, right.
yeah.
And even with the Dakota, talking with him, with the Glenn Matsupichu in Mankato was trying to educate me a little bit. And it's just hard for your brain to imagine they've been here for 10,000 years. And suddenly you see this swarm of locust settlers coming across the prairie,
Yeah.
plowing up prairie, and millions of buffalo that have been here for God knows how many centuries, millennia.
Yeah.
And what that is like, and what Glenn related to me, I said, so what about the young Dakota today? He said, they're in a rage. And they, you know, that doesn't go away.
No.
You know, that doesn't go away from generation to generation.
One of the things that I didn't put in this presentation, but that I always like to share is if you look at the Dakota that are in Minnesota today, they are largely Metawakan. Part of the main reason for that is because they were allowed to remain here in Faribault.
Yeah.
Pretty much every other Dakota band was forced out of the state. The 180 that came here were Metawakan. So Prairie Island, SMSC, Upper and Lower Sioux reservations are all Metawakan self-made reservations. And actually the Lower Sioux reservation for the longest time, up until very recently, were referred to as the Faribault Indians.
Wow.
That was the name that they gave themselves because they were able to directly tie themselves back to here.
You said Lower Sioux, right?
Lower Sioux, yeah.
Because they have a church there.
Yep,
Named
St.
after
Cornelia,
Cornelia.
which is named after Bishop Whipple's wife, and that was actually built by Chief Good Thunder.
Oh.
So,
So you said that you're not sure, people aren't sure who Taopi's daughter's mom is. I noticed that she has Whipple in her name. Could that be?
So we do know that she was named in honor of Bishop Whipple's wife,
Oh, okay.
so.
I was just curious about that.
Oh.
Yeah, so Cornelia Whipple was Bishop Whipple's first wife, that's why it's St. Cornelia Church. You'll see Cornelia all over in Dakota, naming of things throughout, and that's part of the reason why, is just how integral she was to helping Bishop Whipple's mission.
So did Taopi have several wives, or?
As far as I can tell, he didn't have any. That's, again, this goes back to the lack of records, right? And there's also something to bear in mind, which is the idea of Dakota marriage was not recognized by the Minnesota government. So even if they were married, you know, the records wouldn't necessarily reflect it. That's the hard part for us, is it's both gaps in the record, records being lost, records being destroyed, and also just a difference in culture that led to the records having these disparities that there will probably never be a way for us to undo. You had a question?
I don't have a question, I just have a short story.
Sure.
My grandmother gave me this book written by a lady.
Oh, yes.
Here, you probably have a copy.
Several.
And this history just fascinates me, and a lot of good, bad things it runs to. But, and I used to go out and plant flowers with her at Nichols, and she showed me the grapes.
Yep.
And I was just always curious about Taopi, and when I was young, I started, I had horses, and I had my mare and a brother, and her first born was Taopi. Yeah, and her registered name was Taopi Okapi Dawn. Dawn was the mare's name. But yeah, I've always been fascinated with Taopi, so that was one of my horses. That's a great
I don't know as much about the Minnesota history, but Karen and I, we grew up in Montana.
Oh, okay.
And so, of course, the big thing in Montana is Lewis and Clark.
Yes.
And if you read the Lewis and Clark expeditions and what have you, you know, nowadays we'll look at and we see all of these deer that are jumping across the road and everything. We've got more deer and other animals than they had back then, because Lewis would write in his journal every day about what they saw and what have you. But if you look at it, like the Native Americans, they were hunting the deer year round. So they did, the deer population and other animals did not have the chance to rebuild like what we have nowadays. And so they were very dependent upon the buffalo coming up during the summertime. And in fact, many of the wars with the Cheyenne and the Dakota and the other tribes, the Blackfeet and that stuff, were hunting grounds that all of the tribes were dependent upon.
And we don't think about it much today, is how migratory people were. The Dakota were, the Wapakuta in particular, were probably the most traveled of the 7 bands here in Minnesota, because they would travel as far as about sort of the South Dakota border and down to the southern border of Iowa was their yearly sort of traveling grounds, and they would do this giant circle throughout the year. I can't imagine being on the road that often. I drive from all over. So yeah, that's a lot. So, any other questions?
Is there any evidence of trade going on? Because, you know, before the hordes of Europeans came in here,
Yeah.
there were a lot of, it seems like Turtle Mountain was a big trading center, and also it's hard for me to imagine that you didn't have people traveling all the way down to Central and South America.
Yeah, we've actually found in our archaeological collection items from at least the southeast area. We're a little on some of the dates and locations, but we can at least confirm that far. Whether they've gone much further than that is hard to say.
Right.
But yeah, there's evidence all over southern Minnesota of them trading from as far away as Florida, Texas, and then all the way up into the furthest reaches of Canada. So, you know, the rivers were the super highway of the day, right? So at the Dakota were masters of canoe and travel on the river. So no surprise that we have stone tools and artifacts that we've been able to find from many different eras.
Because if they went that far, it's not hard to imagine, they kept going.
Sure.
They
Yeah.
knew who the Aztecs and Incas were.
I'm sure. at
Because
least
I mean,
in
I
one
was
way or
working
another.
with a group of Native Americans, I was the only white guy on the committee, and they looked at me and they said, how'd you get in here? But the guys from out west, the Navajos and stuff, were giving help. The guys from out east said, why did you let them get past you?
Well,
I'll mention that Taopi is 150 years old this year,
mhm.
so they're having a celebration in August down there.
Oh, wonderful.
Now,
The
what-
cemetery.
In Taopi, the
Oh,
town.
wow.
Oh, in the
The
town.
The
Oh.
town
Township.
is